The following is a conversation with Jordan Gray on creative friction, the fine line between passion projects and work, storytelling in design, and overcoming the beginner feeling. Hey, it's Nono, and this is the Getting Simple podcast. So hello, Jordan. How are you?
Hey, Nono, I'm fine. Thanks for having me on. I think that our communication and meeting goes back, you said 10 years to you teaching me how to make Spanish omelets and our mutual love for good music and photography and hand sketching and art. A lot in common from the beginning.
I always liked your design taste and aesthetics. I will post links to your site online on the show notes. I've been looking at some of your videos that you have there, and I was impressed by the quality of the footage, like some of the photography of architectural buildings and some of the videos that you've put together. Some of them I think are more animation-like, which looks really realistic, and some others are more like little documents or documentaries of projects that have been built and are currently in use. How did you get into all of these things as an architecture student, right? Like you studied architecture initially, but I've always seen you with your camera in your hand and liking details and taking pictures of things.
The camera has always been a way for me to see things differently and to sort of document the process. It definitely goes back to school for me, just wanting a good way to capture quality images of models and things that I was creating back in architecture school. When it really clicked for me was in the last year of undergrad. I was in an urban design studio, and I had a professor that was open to different techniques for presenting the project. And that was the first time I dove into a film project where through the semester we were documenting the site, and we decided to make a short film for the final video. It went over really well, and that's when I saw that you can really show a lot more depth and narrative and storytelling, through filmmaking as opposed to just a 2D or printed drawing set. I think they both have their purposes, but that's when I opened my eyes. So, there's these alternate paths and these tangents within the architecture field that I think were pretty early on back then. This was, like you said, close to 10 years ago still, but even now is when I'm starting to see that there are specified fields and roles in firms that's related to photography, videography, visualization and renderings, computational design. All these little niche roles are starting to really emerge in the architecture profession now.
How do you cope with the struggle when you find things that you enjoy, that you want to spend more time doing, but you don't have the time for them?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. The struggle in, I guess, the professional field. I have started a new job recently where my role in the firm is visualization specialist. So I do have more of a solidified position where I have time to study these strategic initiatives within the firm. So I'm not always just on production and design, and I'm hardly ever actually working through the documentation part of a project now. So I do have the ability to test new things and stretch my creative bones when it comes to that. I'm fortunate that I do have the time to test things out, but there's still always that feeling of, there's a deadline in a week, and when that one's done, there's a deadline in another week. It's just the nature of architecture is there's always things to get finished, and it's easy to let 6 months pass, and then you notice that a lot of the bigger picture things that aren't just project related sort of fall to the side. And so, that is still a challenge. I don't have a direct answer. It's always part of figuring that out, is where do you find the time to try new things? Because whenever you're in the process of trying new things out, in that moment, you're aware that it's going to take longer. So if you have a 1 week deadline, it's hard to jump in and try new software or, new processes to get things done. But I think the silver lining is knowing that once you do that one time, you might save a lot of time on the next one and the next one. So the point is to do these new, techniques, knowing that it's going to make your life easier and help out the firm and all the future endeavors. I'm always making sure that I'm in communication with others that I work with, that, I'm going to be separating a little bit for a week from production to make sure that I can dive in to test out new things. I know currently I have Unreal Engine and Blender that's on my agenda to dive more into. I keep seeing a lot of, new videos about that and different tests, different examples. And I think there's a pretty high ceiling for what you can learn there. But I think there's a lot of future overlap, definitely between ArcViz and Unreal Engine and Blender, as opposed to things that you thought were just for ArcViz, like Twinmotion and Lumion and Enscape and things that work within architecture programs, these ones that firms are using for cinematography like Unreal Engine. I think that that's definitely going to bleed a bit more into the architecture profession in the years ahead.
Yeah, I've recently saw there is a Matrix Awakens or something demo of Unreal, right? Which is uncanny. I haven't watched it yet. I just saw some comparison footage and some scenes look even better than the original.
Things like that get me excited. Yeah, it was running off I think a PlayStation 5, so just running off a console hardware, and where those are starting to go real time with textures and lighting, and it's pretty impressive.
I've been meaning to get into Unreal for a while now. I actually downloaded it a few weeks ago. I haven't put the time. I did some Unity back in like 6 years or maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I haven't got into Unreal yet. One question is, do you have any processes to, or like you talked about the long-term plan, right? Like trying to see the big picture of things and not just getting to the local deadlines. For me, I think there are two things, right? One, having that long picture present every day so you can create a space or time to do the things that you want to do to have learn in the long run. And another one is try to maybe plan ahead in those deadlines that you have to do and create not artificial deadlines, but like set checkpoints, right? Where maybe you add little techniques that you have to use in your different deadlines. And then when you're in deadline mode, you're embedded into learning as well. Can you think of anything that you have done maybe that is deliberately practicing a skill lately, that some of these things that we're talking about?
I do feel like lately it's been so much busyness and back-to-back kind of deadline mode that I haven't tested as much in the past half a year. And a lot of that is also due to, the client might ask for a set of still images. And a lot of times, they might not know what else you can do. So you might try to come up with an animation or a panoramic image or something to bring to the table that they might not even expect. I'm starting to like the trend of, if it's kind of modeled and set up, it's not a lot of extra effort sometimes to set up some animations and panoramas. It used to take a long time, but bringing these extra things to the table for the client. But when you get stuck again and always pushing the boundaries and trying to do more, then it kind of slows down trying things outside of that realm. It's easy to get fixated on things you learned in the past. Like you don't want to sometimes to dive into new software because you don't want to feel like I'm going to completely erase hours I spent doing things in the past. It's like I spent 2 years maybe really deep diving into V-Ray. So then you switch to something. I do think that the skills carry over too, but there's still always that thought of, I got very good at this one thing, so now switching over, it feels like I'm losing a little bit of my time that I built up in the past. In my personal case, I through school and in my first few years at my first job outside of school, they were doing Podium for renderings. I brought V-Ray to the table. We kind of switched over to V-Ray as a firm. The way you adjust even materials and lighting, I think it was way more kind of data driven and numbers. Like you got used to what kind of data and input you had to do to make things work correctly. And I think the ceiling was definitely a bit higher with V-Ray than it was with some of these real-time renderers like Lumion or Twinmotion. So let's say 2 years down the road, Lumion in particular to me was starting to look a lot better, closer to V-Ray. It didn't have as much realism. I think for a while people associated it with kind of a video game look. And even now Lumion doesn't have why can't I think of what it's called now? The ray tracing, that's one thing that's been holding it back, is kind of getting these accurate shadows and like ambient occlusion and some of the reflection that V-Ray has. But I do think Lumion and Twinmotion caught up a lot to V-Ray. So my point being is I spent all this time on V-Ray. I started to see how fast you could do things with these real-time engines. You could maybe, if it wasn't optimized, you might have a rendering taking 5 hours in V-Ray. You might get that same one that's 90% the same quality in Lumion in 30 seconds. The modeling's the same. It was way easier to start to bring in 3D assets like trees or people or furniture into Lumion. So there was enough reasons for us to switch away from V-Ray to Lumion. I do think that a lot of the understanding for how to work with materials carried over, but there was still a part of it switching to Lumion that was like, I'm kind of abandoning like these things that I got really comfortable with and really good at. So it's like the feeling of leaving something that's comfortable, leaving something that you studied a lot. But I mean, I do think that's also part of architecture firm is everyone was doing AutoCAD for a long time. Then along came Revit, and it was kind of had to pull off the Band-Aid to switch to things like Revit. So I think that's always going to be the case. There's always going to be new software, always better. So that's always been my motto to live by doing this, is if there's a better way to do something, it's usually worth spending the time to do it. But initially I was kind of stuck on like, I don't want to lose 5 years of studying something to switch and start from scratch and feel like a beginner or a newbie all over again, because you felt like an expert. Now you're starting as a beginner. So that was my specific example, was kind of switching from something like V-Ray to something like the environment of Twinmotion or Lumion.
I mean, you start from scratch, but you have a lot of knowledge that, that belongs to the same area of expertise, and also have the 5 years of experience or how many years of experience that you have to appreciate how much better what you have now is, right? Like, we're seeing that many of the younger generations won't know. I mean, even us, we don't know what it was before maybe the 2000s without the internet and other sorts of communication, right? We started in an era that allows us to be in contact constantly with everyone, right? This happened gradually. It wasn't like that all the time. But I think spending a lot of time optimizing or doing something that doesn't need to be done, which might feel afterwards as a dumb thing, but you were using that knowledge for many years, right?
It translates, yes. It's kind of overcoming that thought process so you don't feel like you're losing it. But you're definitely right that ultimately it's not losing it and switching it. It's just translating it and transposing it into something different. I mean, it's similar to sketching and being an artist and kind of having that mind frame of composition and setting things up on paper kind of translates to doing it on camera, which also translates to doing it in a rendering engine. There's definitely a lot of overlap between, those different medias. Your other question too is, specific examples of taking extra time to do something new, knowing it will pay off, later. As we've been pushing things like Lumion a bit more, in the past few months, I've been trying to build up our asset library. So again, since school, the way we used to do things with people always was drop the people in, try to light them in Photoshop, drop the shadows in Photoshop, kind of paint them into the scene so they fit. It was a tedious process. I think it can look nice and there's still reason to do it sometime, but we looked into, it's worth maybe buying some really high quality 3D models of people. So we started building up this asset library of 3D people. Yeah, it took an extra day or something to find these, download them, get them on the server, figure out how to use them properly in whichever modeling software. But then after that, that gives the ability for everyone to just drop these in, and you're getting people that are already, rendered in with the right lighting and shadows and fit into the environment with the colors correctly. So that's another example of seeing something new, trying to figure out how to incorporate it, knowing that it might take a little extra time at the beginning, but it starts to definitely pay off and save time quickly in the future.
Yeah, that happened to me during architecture school, and a bit when I started working. I was building this asset library of AlphaCAD trees and people and objects and things like this, because I was becoming an architect at that moment. So I thought, all this effort will pay off and stuff. And now it sits on some folder I never visit on my Dropbox account. And if I want to get any of that, as you say, maybe you just Google Images and quickly cut off new people, right? On demand. So you never know, right? Sometimes it pays off, and I see it more as an automation, right? Something that will save you time in the future, and that you're thinking, okay, hold on, I've done this process manually 8 times already. Let's try to be a bit more efficient, right? I think that pays off. There is actually this chart that I don't have right now. Maybe I can look for it if I find it and put it on the show notes. It's like a chart that says like whether something is worth automating or not, depending on how much time it takes you to do it manually every time and what frequency you do it, right? So for example, like if you do something maybe that is 30 seconds, but you do it like 100 times a day, maybe it's worth automating, right? But if you do it and it's 1 or 5 minutes and it's only once a month, it's not really worth it, right? And also how much time does it take to automate? Because many times, at least for me, like I have to program, like actually do small commands, custom coding to automate things on the, I don't know, for example, on this podcast, right? Like to publish things or to format things or to show things. I've been on the process of doing that. And I don't know, I'm trying it out. And I know that many times you'll be investing time for something that, say you're formatting a given text because that's the way you want to publish it online now. But in 3 months you say, I'm not going to publish that way anymore. I'll switch to video or instead of text or, whatever you think.
I think there's no shame in sort of changing the process, and I don't know if help's the right word, but there's no shame in finding other methods of making things happen smoother. My example would be modeling things or modeling 3D libraries of furniture or vegetation. It might take hours. I mean, someone could spend hours and hours trying to model a chair, where you can go on a site, find one super high quality, spend $20 and download it, and you're going to save yourself maybe 3 hours of time. It's actually cheaper for the company anyway. So I'm definitely a big advocate of freeing up your own time in ways that you can, if you can save more time to be creative and be in that art mindset. I think that you've also mentioned that too with, editing videos, setting up your scripts, or having help with kind of even cutting podcast videos and putting them together. Things that you can do to free up creative time is definitely worthwhile. And there's value there.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 step process. First is like figure out what you want to do. First, you need to see, okay, I'm going to record podcast, for example. So you need to buy the material, see how you do it. You got to learn how to do it. That's the first step. And then the second step would be, let's repeat this process over and over, right? Let's record, edit, and release. Record, edit, and release. And after you've done it, maybe, 10 times or maybe even 40 times, then you can go back and say, okay, what are the steps that I always do that I can say, at least make some sort of manual of how, basically writing down how you do things. And even if you do it manually, you go step by step and reproduce that. And that saves me time. It's kind of routines or workflows that you write down. And then the next step is automation, which I personally prefer to try to see what things can be automated with existing software or custom code. And then what cannot be automated and it's really time consuming. I've been trying to delegate it, right? To externalize it and basically get contractors to help me out editing video or audio, right? So that's kind of the process that I've been trying to follow. So it's basically 5 steps, right? It's like learning, repeating, then like capturing your routine, and then trying to see if you maybe automate with code. And if you cannot do it with code, you go to humans, right? I would say, I mean, that's what happens, right? If you can do things with the computer on your own or with programs, you won't ask for help somebody else unless you're too lazy.
So I want to bounce this one question back to you. What's your personal way of sort of maintaining growth and creativity, and not falling into just comfort zone and repetition? So how do you personally make sure that you're keeping yourself growing?
I follow the advice of Anders Ericsson, which is a big advocate of deliberate practice. I've talked about deliberate practice a lot on the podcast. I think he sadly died last year, right? He basically established a lot of the productivity theory in terms of how you become better at certain skills. And why I mentioned deliberate practice is you talked about deadlines before. There is this sentence which is faking the deadline, which is trying to set deadlines to yourself. And usually it's really hard. If the deadline is not real, you won't push yourself to maybe skip something that you were going to do and finish it, right? I don't say that I necessarily want to do that. I don't want to skip meeting friends or family or my partner or doing things that I consider leisure and not work. But I do set a periodicity. So I set a recurrent schedule for the things that I want to become better at and try to formalize it. Sometimes hobbies become pseudo work. It's not work. They're side projects like this podcast. And what I try to do is like be diligent in saying, okay, at least I'm going to write 200 words a day. At least I'm going to publish an edited sketch and a piece of text every Tuesday. At least I'm going to publish a podcast episode every month. And at least I'm going to do a live stream every week, right? So this keeps growing and trying to unify the different things that I'm doing. But I try to do it that way. And that way I ensure that I do at least a bit of everything daily. And I scratch maybe 20 minutes a day to write and sketch, or like maybe 1, 2, or even 10 hours a month to podcast, right? It's really hard to differentiate hobbies from work when you're really passionate about your hobbies, right? Like, for example, you love photography, but you end up doing work for other people that involves taking photos of maybe weddings or buildings or whatever people want you to take pictures of, or making film. So basically is trying to create deadlines and commitments with yourself that look more real and making them public. So actually publishing and having a cadence makes you feel that you need to do it. So for example, now I feel like if I don't publish a like small essay and a sketch on Tuesdays, people will say, okay, what happened this Tuesday, right? And I just follow that cadence. I think today I made like 903 days that I've been doing that, right? It's once a week. It's like 128 posts. But yeah, I don't know. That's one way to answer your question, which is trying to have a periodicity. And lately it's been harder because I'm trying to also not do too much work after 6 p.m., right? Like I try to disconnect and actually make a point for weekends to be weekends and afternoons to be afternoons, and not just spread work into your leisure life and also personal life. If you are passionate about something, it's really hard for you not to think about it while you're, let's say, resting or taking a break or like going on vacation. Many times those are the best moments where ideas just spark and you can note it down. So, okay, when I go back to the drawing board, I'll work on this on the shower or things like that. That's something maybe you can comment more on later, but you have 2 kids already, I think, right? 2?
6 years old and 1.
So you have 2 kids, and that is a real imposition for you to have to not be working at certain moments of your life, right? You need to educate them, you need to take care of them and do things like this. I don't have kids yet, and I was living 3 years ago. I was living still as a student or working in Boston by myself, like having a long distance relationship. And, I have as much time as I wanted to manage for myself, and even to, let's say, work on weekends if I didn't want to go out, or work at night or ththings like this. But when you start creating a family, or maybe have habits that are more socialization habits or other things like this, I think you need to there is external forces that get you to realize that you cannot just use all of your time for your pet projects and things like this, right? So for me, what happens is, and this is advice that I also read from Cal Newport, is like, even before you have kids, even before you have to take care of other people, you should make a point to have that tight schedule, because that will make you more productive during your so-called work hours, right? I try to do that. I won't say, I won't say that I'm perfectly doing that. I'm recording this at 8 p.m. In the afternoon because it's the only time I can connect with people from the US, from Spain. It's at least a motivation to say, okay, I want to commit to these projects over every month, right? And not leave it, because it's, as you said before, it's super easy to see, okay, 6 months pass and I haven't done this thing that I wanted to do. And today, I don't know how many, like this year has been really weird for me to record interviews, like the one that we're recording right now. I've been experimenting with other podcasting formats. And then I say, okay, I'm going to sleep in and just not let interviews aside for a bit on the podcast. And it was probably like 6 or 8 months since I had recorded an interview. I release many episodes, but they're like maybe solo episodes that I do, or two-way conversations with other people discussing specific topics. Yeah, so that would be my answer.
One of the things actually that stuck in my mind from reviewing some of the reading you sent me was the periodicity, and that seemed like such an eye-opening and simple kind of answer, almost too simple, but that really is a big part of growth, is just finding a little bit of time each day. I think that's what got me into the visualization field in architecture. Was one summer I just really became infatuated with, architectural visualization. So this wasn't due to schooling. It was just due to me during the summer saying, I'm going to learn V-Rays. Every day I was watching tutorials and just testing it myself, separately outside of school or outside of work. I don't think I've done that as much again, recently. I think I've done it with work and during work and used for work, but there's definitely a lot of things that it's easy to get inspired with everything that's available online now. You can go on YouTube, and I fall asleep a lot of nights watching 30 minutes of a Blender video or 30 minutes of an Unreal video, or there's just whatever. Like, I don't know why that's kind of my way to fall asleep now, is watching others kind of working in these other software. So I fall asleep feeling inspired and then thinking, all right, the next day it's like, I'm going to download this and try this for 30 minutes. And then, that might not happen. You kind of lose that buzz a little bit in the morning. So periodicity seems simple, but I'm going to definitely try to stick to that a bit more, even if it's just 20 minutes of even writing down in a notebook some tangible ways to move forward, or just getting that software open and becoming familiar with it. Because I do think it kind of snowballs, and a few weeks or a month later, that's when you at least become somewhat familiarized with the software. You might not be an expert yet, but you're not a beginner, so you don't feel as much stuck and treading through mud. You're kind of past that painful early stages.
We're referring here to a little essay that I published that is called Beginner Feeling. And this happened to me today. So for example, I've been doing other type of podcasting. I've been doing live streaming, but I hadn't been doing an interview. We're recording remotely today, as you can see. But if you let it sit for too long, any skill that you have, might be public speaking, might be sketching, might be writing, even writing by hand. You notice that after months of not writing by hand, your hand is sore. The muscles are not used to it. And you just say like, wow, that's super weird. And, you just have to commit to it. And even if it's not the best interview of your life, if you were to do one interview every single day, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, you'll become so much better. So for example, I am a bit more comfortable talking to the mic here and the camera because I try to do a live stream every Thursday. And that's like from 1 to 2 hours. So I'm used to talking to this camera, right? Like my brain is accustomed to it, so the light doesn't bother me. And there is a lot of habituation that you have to do, right? And I will talk about something else, right? There is a lot of cheating that is super easy to cheat with anything that you do often enough if you don't get enough concentration and time. And why I say this is because I try to read wise quotes, which is something that I'm not going to talk about. It's just a way to save your Kindle highlights on the web. That takes me like 1 minute or 2 minutes to do, but every day. I try to meditate 10 minutes. I try to do one sketch, even if it's super small, and then I write 200 words, right? I only miss really, really few days where, my days are hectic, and then when I go back home, I'm super tired. Maybe I have a headache. I go to sleep, and then I wake up and say like, oh, I didn't sketch yesterday. And that's no way back, right? There is this habit chain thing where you have like a Google Docs, a spreadsheet, and you cross off when you do something. So there is like these white dots that you can see that you've missed one day, right? Why is it easy to cheat? Even though, I just sketch every day, because just that thing, like I said before, like if you don't write by hand, your hand will be sore, right? If you get your pencil and your notebook every day, just do a few traces, your brain gets accustomed to do that every day, to look at an object and portray it in 2D while you're looking at it in 3D. All these, it doesn't transfer. Taking photos or doing something else won't help you learn how to capture objects from 3D into your notebook. The only thing that helps you is actually capturing things into your notebook with your hand. So I try to do that every day. I try shading, I try watercoloring, I try sketching, and many days I cheat, as I said, because I do maybe a 1 minute sketch, like maybe a 2 minute sketch or something like that. But then I realize that when I'm calm and I have maybe an hour to sketch, I don't have any commitments, then that day I can sit, I can enjoy sketching better, and it pays off, because that day, all of that work, maybe from probably not 20 days in a row cheating, as I call it, right? Like doing silly sketches, but it pays off. You can see that, wow, like it's so much easier to capture these objects and the lines, and it kind of happens magically, but it's the opposite of magically, because it's basically you practicing every single day the same thing, and then it happens magically, right? Which is counterintuitive. And it happens the same way with meditation. Like I meditate for 10 minutes. What does that mean? If you are distracted, if you're thinking of something else, your mind drifts, you're not fully on it, and then you say, 10 minutes passed, blah, and you feel that you've cheated because that day you couldn't really clear your mind and you don't get anything out of it. But it's worth trying just for the day that maybe you say, okay, today I have the time, I can sit 10 minutes, and then 15 minutes or 20 minutes pass and say, okay, now I can continue, go on with my day, and it was worth it. And how I cheat with writing is that maybe I just describe whatever happened on the day or whatever is on my mind quickly, which is something that is just like writing a journal. It's not something I'm going to be able to publish later because it's bad and it doesn't go anywhere, but maybe in the future I'll make use of it. So numbers would be like 10 minutes a day of meditation. That's like, what is it? Like 3,650 minutes a year meditating. And, if you write 200 words, like a quick calculation here, at least you'll do 73,000 words a year. So I definitely would bet anything that among those 70,000 words, there's something worth reading, right? So you can go back and then review, and with relax, you say, okay, now I'm going to highlight, and maybe I make a bigger essay or like a more workout piece. Or maybe like out of 365 drawings, something probably is worth looking at. This more than periodicity there is daily deliberate practice, which is, I know some days I'll struggle, which is kind of counterintuitive. I'm struggling through something that I call a hobby. But, it's the same that the person who's going to the Olympics, right? They know that some days they won't want to go swimming or playing golf or doing something like that, but they know that it will pay off. The day they want to play a tournament, the day they have to compete, they will be stronger, they'll be more focused, and they'll be able to enjoy the day.
Would you say that struggle ties into, our past quick discussion on friction? Would that be a positive friction, something that sort of propels you to get past it, or propels you again to grow or move forward?
That more than friction, that I would call resistance, right? It's your resistance to doing because maybe you feel that you're tired or you won't be good enough, or it's not something that you have time for, right? Like have time, we all have the same amount of hours, 168 hours a week. From the outside, when somebody says, okay, I've done these renders or these videos or these whatever in these 3 months, it says like, wow, I don't have time for that. But then if you look into their daily routines, they're focused toward that, right? So I would say when I refer to friction, there is something different that I mentioned, which is, you want to release a podcast, you want to make a rendering, or that you want to, write an essay. But there are steps that are preventing you from getting there fast, right? And it might be the silly thing of having to go to your wardrobe and looking for the right pen, maybe go buy a pen because the one you had is broken, or where are my watercolors, or where do I sit? I need to make space, or, it's the friction to get doing the thing that you want to do.
Yes, I can think of for a friction just to get this podcast going on my side, finding my microphone stand, getting the microphone out of storage, and just things themselves that aren't big deals, but it's enough to be like, it's a sidestep from what I'm doing today. So then you start to kind of let them pile up too. So I think if you don't address some of them as they come along, then it becomes, a bigger mound of friction, and then it's even harder to try to get over that hump. That's a good point. I'm trying to think the best way to think about how that affects work or even just personal growth. And usually when I'm saying personal growth, as far as this podcast is going, I'm talking about kind of the creative or artistic growth. I think talking to peers and coworkers, I think that's usually kind of what they consider growth too, or friction in work. They might feel like they're stuck doing details or something mundane or something that's maybe not in line with what they consider them growing as a professional. So I'm trying to think what's the question there. That's another point I was trying to get to without being too specific is, the idea of being in a job, being in work, and feeling like you're doing things that are keeping you from moving forward, growth. If you feel that way, does that mean you should be trying to change something, or does that mean that's work and that's what it's supposed to be? What's your thought, I guess, on work versus something that maybe you could change? Because again, personally, I feel like I've shifted things to make my passion a bigger part of what my work is. Is that something that everyone can do in the architecture profession? Is that something that everyone can do after a certain amount of time? Or is that something where some people get stuck and pigeonholed doing something they might not want to be doing?
Sometimes you just might be allocated into something that you didn't want to do. And also you need to be careful what you wish for, right? Like even the thing that you love the most, as we talked about before, in terms of not wanting to go to practice if you're a swimmer or like a runner or something, anything that you set yourself to do daily, you will face resistance, right? Because anything that you do too often, it becomes your job. And if you don't have the choice to stop doing it because you won't get paid otherwise, you might get to hate the thing that you love. So there is this other, I think it's so good they can't ignore you. And I'm surprised about how many Cal Newport books I recommend on this podcast or mention. There is a section of the book, or almost the entire book goes around that concept, and is the question of, should you follow your passion, right? Like what does it mean? So is it worth it, or is it better to separate what you do for work than what you like doing? And my take is that it's good to have a separation between the things that you do for pay for other people, that is work, and the things that you opt in and you choose that you will do because you want to do. And as you said, you can change, and you have a word into, okay, now I'm going to stop posting a publication every Tuesday. I'm going to do it monthly, or I'm not going to do it anymore. Or I can change. Now I'm doing Lumion things, but now I'm going to do writing because I want to do that. It's good to have that duality where you don't directly quit to follow your passion. You have something that you say, okay, this is work. And there's two things that you can do. One is find a work, so a job that actually lets you do that switching that you mentioned before, that you have opportunities to develop your skills. I feel really fortunate to be able to choose a lot of the things that I get involved in my daily job. And I have opportunities to also do internal public speaking, maybe go to events, learn internally, apply the things that I want to learn, and maybe even sometimes produce training materials. And that is something that I want to become better at and practice. Not everyone has that opportunity, right? Because they just get told what they have to do and they don't have flexibility. But I personally like that separation between, okay, these are instead of side projects, I call them passion projects, whatever I do because I like it and I can stop whenever I want. Long term, it would be good if I can monetize in some way. I'm not monetizing nothing right now. I'm just investing in these projects because I want to actually share things with people and connect with others. But yeah, I trust the advice of Cal Newport. That is basically something that we all know, but many times we can get confused with. Like, don't follow your passion unless you're super, super sure that will give you a sustainable way of living and you're going to be able to make money. Not make a lot of money quickly, but just make money as soon as you get started to sustain the lifestyle that you have in your current job.
I think it comes down definitely more to, does it feel gratifying? If you're giving years and years of your life doing something, are you content doing this? Is it gratifying? More so than, are you making a lot of money, but is it fulfilling? Is it satisfying?
Yeah, architecture, as I know it, right? I haven't had too many jobs. But the architecture student culture, I think it's bad for that because we get used to overspend our leisure time in working in projects that, yeah, we love it, but we forget about many aspects of our social life, and scheduling leisure time as much as you schedule your professional life is important for what you're saying, to be able to have long-term goals and be able to develop them as well, maybe social skills or activities that you can do with your loved ones. And we often forget that because when we're students, everything goes, right? You can spend hours and hours and hours and nobody tells you you're doing something wrong. But in some way we are, right? You're embracing a culture that then it feels weird when you try to oppose yourself to it at the workplace because, you were doing that as a student and everyone who enters here has that mindset. And then when I say here, I mean like the architecture studio where you're an intern and yesterday or maybe even at the same time, you're spending hours and hours at your studio at school, why not do it here on the weekends on the, on your paid job? So software development in many places, I think, allows for a lot more planning. Like I know of architecture studios and delivery studios that try to embed Scrum and Agile practices, like basically being able to weigh how hard each task is and how long it will take for you to complete in order to know that you can go home at 5 p.m. because, you can continue working on it tomorrow. It's not like deadline. But yeah, that's hard. I mean, it really depends on the company you are, the team you are in, the project you're working on at the moment and things like this. But overall, I don't buy the thing of like, just give it all for the company you're working on right now in terms of your personal time, right?
And not just given to the company. I feel like the architecture practice in general gives a lot of themselves to the client, for free. I think that our profession in general is fallen into the trap of giving away a lot of our time for free to the client. I feel like that's definitely a deeper conversation, but it's something I've noticed in multiple firms, not just ones I'm in, but ones that friends are in and other ones locally. It's just this mindset that even if it takes us a week longer or a month longer than we originally thought, it's just we kind of do this and finish this. And I feel like we give a lot more of our emotional side and time, to clients than other professions. Like you're not going to see I don't know why doctor's the best example, but I mean, they give a lot of their time too to help, but it just feels like we give a lot away of ourselves in the architecture field.
I think the architecture studio and the architect falls a bit in love with whatever artifact that you're involved in its creation. And, even more for architectural firms, you're not building a building for a client. I mean, if you were building a bunker or like a secret place nobody's going to see, even so, you would want to do a great job. But think about it, every time that you build a building, you're creating your own portfolio, right? You say, oh, I designed that one, and I designed that one, and I designed that one. And you want it to be good, you want it to be as good as it can be. So we end up doing things just for that, but we don't get paid more. We don't get, that depends on the culture of your workplace. Again, like maybe some places pay you the extra hours, others don't. Or maybe the client says, okay, we allocate for this extra care that you took for the project. But it's really, really, really hard. I would say, in programming, there is also teams that might go the extra mile to make a product better. Others might just do, okay, this is contractor work, I'm going to do it, it works, and F it.
I think that also brings up a good point of at least a personal focus of mine and, trying to stretch this out into the firm. And maybe we're seeing other firms starting to do this, but it's something that I was gravitating to personally, but I feel like I'm starting to see it as more of a buzzword. I've seen more and more lectures and seminars where they're using the word storytelling. It's something that I've been trying to capture with videography and trying to pull out this narrative for a project. A lot of times we spend years of our life and then doing the drawing sets, working through details, then this building gets built, and then we go and send a photographer. They might catch 10 photographs and they end up on our website. That's kind of the end piece. And it feels like there's so much that was lost along the way, like all of those little client interactions and seeing how people use the space. That's one thing I'm trying to also bring back, at least to our firm, is have a focus on people, try to film even those little discussions with the client, have them talk about the project. There's a narrative that gets lost when you just do a photo shoot. So how can you pull out this piece that's more human scale, and how can you market that? How can you put that on the website or social media, but also just in general, how do you not lose that piece along the way? So again, that's something I've been pushing, but it's oddly enough, in the last 6 months, I've seen a lot of seminars pop up where it's like, here's a discussion on storytelling. So is that also something you've been hearing your way, is a focus on storytelling in the architecture field?
I'm not that involved in architecture, as you know. I'm more involved in software development, and I don't think we apply the storytelling that much, except for when you actually have to convey any idea, you have to tell the story of why that's needed. And you become better the more that you explain things and the more that you work on things and then try to unwrap them into something that other person can understand. That will also come with practice, right? Like becoming better at storytelling or doing whatever that is. I did, though, read about how to make your nonfiction writing more compelling. There is a book called You Can't Make This Stuff Up, which is a really good title, right? If you're writing nonfiction, everything has to be true unless you're a liar. And there is no fiction allowed unless you're explicit about it's fiction, right? So a fiction book would just never say that it's fiction. And what I learned from there, and it works, like I've tried, and sometimes I do it without thinking about it, but others I do it on purpose, which is something you should probably always do, but it will come naturally as you do more, is that you have to embed a part of story that is human, that somebody else can relate to and that they can take to their person, right? Things that, oh, I lost my keys and blah, blah, blah. And the person reading or seeing what you're saying will relate to that day or when they lost theirs, right? So there is this dance between story and facts and story and facts and story that every single process that you do, even what we're doing here, I think today, needs a bit of that for people to not leave and say, oh, these guys just giving me details. It's like, what's the speed of your machine and blah, blah, blah. But you need an iPhone, for example, if you look at Apple, they always tell you a story. They don't focus, for engineers and for people who want to buy and stuff, they always throw out the numbers. Like, it's faster, it's better, it's lighter, whatever. But there's always a story involved, which is like, how does that make your life better? Like, how do you relate to other people because you have a phone or other things like this? So I think it's more, as you were saying before, I think we're referring to the same video that I watched where, there's people who actually are using the buildings that you guys design that are talking about how the building makes the education better, or like relation between the different people that use it better. Not only about the facts of like, oh, this building shields from the wind better, and like...
I think we fall into the trap a lot of, we're architects and we're trying to market to other architects. A lot of times architecture firms, their websites are built for other architects, which is, I think it's a bit of a mistake when we should be trying to make our websites appeal to people like my wife, for instance, who's a teacher. If I'm trying to get her convinced about, why this building is good, why it's useful, why it's life-changing for the people that use it, it's not posting the square footage and the
plans and
the sustainability features. It's here is, again, for one of the videos that I post, is like, here's a librarian speaking about how her day-to-day life is better because of this building. So, I think there's some merit in trying to not market for other architects, not try to just get that Art Daily spread that other designers are going to see, but how can we pull in all those other eyes and views of people that might not be inherently design thinkers? So how can you appeal to them? And it's focusing on the human experience more than the building details.
Yeah, and you can see that even with online services and products, right? Many times you go to the website, and if you go to the footer or maybe on the header menu, you can see that they say for podcasters or for videographers or for blah, blah, blah. And then they tell you the story that connects to your world. And that's a lot of what big data is about. It's like, okay, if this person is telling me because of what he's browsing online that he's a software engineer, I'm going to market him these products that tell a story for engineers. And at the end of the day, storytelling is a lot about marketing. I mean, there's a lot of truth if you're just telling a story, but the point of doing something leveled between like story and facts is to hook the reader. If you're talking about a website or about maybe an architectural firm, it's not about hooking the reader. It's about hooking the client or whoever feels that they need something.
And then these are the things that I think that start to, show your branding and your image behind your company. Again, everyone knows that we're an architecture firm. Everyone comes to expect a building from an architecture firm, but the things that relate to, the human elements, I think that's what starts to define, who you are as a firm. That's what starts to make others want to work with you when they start to hear positive, reviews or words from clients in the past. I think that's what starts to make them feel comfortable and trusting of you more so than here's pictures of a building we finished. it might be a little bit of a tangent, but it's been on my mind a lot lately. This is a conversation that I've had with some coworkers, had with some friends. It's something that I was aware of at my last firm, current firm, and just, in general. And this might relate to other things outside of just office branding and imaging. So I'm curious how you might pull some things from this that's separate from that. So as an example, you're probably aware of people on social media or companies that you follow. It's like instantly, it's like, that's good design. I'm attracted to this. It's like, there's not always a narrative, but there's something appealing to the way all their work kind of works together and flows on social media. There's ones that you consider like, objectively, it's like, this is good what they're posting and you're attracted to it, whether that's a company or, it even goes back to like way back when in high school, I used to record music. I had a few friends, we would record things, like we were happy with it, but it was like, this isn't necessarily something I would listen to. It's like we were making content that wasn't what I would typically listen to. The process was fun, but I wasn't always attracted to the end result. The question I'm trying to get at is how do you, and I don't know if it's just a matter of like the clients and work that you're working with, and if you're in a rut of not making finished products that you necessarily want to identify with, how do you switch away from that? Or, the bigger picture, if you understand what is considered good design and kind of a branding and an image that you want to look like, how do you get to that next step? There's always this barrier that I've been aware of, let's say for a small architecture firm or a medium-sized architecture firm, that they're trying to kind of break out of that mold. Like they definitely have the talent. Maybe they need to change some of the work they're doing, but you yourselves posting things that represents that, like you understand what it is and you see it and recognize it. But how do you get yourself to that level where you're also producing the kinds of work that you would follow? Because I've seen this before, like at firms, and I may have even mentioned this at the beginning. Right now, we're going through a lot of rebranding at our current firm. We want to change how we're perceived and seen. So this is something that's fresh on my mind, is how do you make sure that it's not just a skin deep move? It can't just be, here's a new graphics package and logo. Like, how do you actually make a real change that starts to push you, and get momentum growing in that direction? So like you're seen as this high design firm that you want to be. I think there's been times where it's like, we don't want to share our website to get new people to come here because it doesn't really represent how we feel about ourselves. Or sometimes it's like, would I follow ourselves on, if I didn't work at this place, would I follow the social media kind of thing? Like those are some of the examples. But
as you described it, that happens to me exactly the same. You lose a bit when you're kind of sculpting a website or like a project or something, you lose basically that first look sight, right? Like that feeling that you get when you first enter into a building that you'd never seen before, or like first time you see an image online. You've been working on this illustration for hours or days, and you don't have that critic point of view of somebody else that comes off and then just sees that for the first time, right? That's what you're trying to look for. I feel that with writing. Like I do writing and then I lose track. If I take a look at it, I try to reread it many times, but then I lose that critical point of view. Many times what's helped is something that you cannot do in architecture, at least if you're in a firm working for a client, which is let the draft sit for days or months or years and then reread it. And maybe it's something that you've published already and you forgot about. Then you enter on the site or on that page as a foreign reader, right? Somebody who's forgotten about those words and is seeing that fresh from the first time. Then you're talking to your future self, but you don't remember. And that's the only way that I can think of that I've experienced what you're talking about, which is, okay, I can now feel what somebody else may feel, what I would have felt if somebody else had written this and I had found it online, right? They say that if you know how to create the things that other people would like, then you have good taste. That's super hard. And I think for me, it goes with looking at, as you said, what other people are doing and trying to analyze that first look at something that gives you a certain feeling. For me, this happens with my website. Like I change it a lot. And when you change the typeface or maybe change the layout or stuff, you like it. But then you start seeing it over and over again as you enter, and then you get bored of it. It even looks ugly. It looks old. But some other people say, it looks nice, it's simple, it's whatever. You lose that point. And that's why often there is rebranding and there's redesigns and things like this. I often look at Frank Quimeros's website. He's a writer and designer, or designer and writer. And he changes it a lot. He changes it, he uses it as a playground where he can be changing the colors, the fonts, and the layouts and things like this, maintaining the overall structure of the site. And I think that exercise of changing often gives you also a critical point of what worked before and it doesn't work now. And, a comparison point that if you're just making little tweaks to something, you just won't notice because you're used to that space. Now there's something that's changed. But if you change things in a big way, in a significant way, then that will make an impact that you can see what things you're missing and what things you're not. So I guess in architecture, you could do the same. You could say, okay, I'm going to get off or going to leave this building for a few months or something, and then I get back in, and then you can experience it as somebody who hasn't seen it before. So yeah, I guess you need time to distance from your own creations to have a critical point until probably you become so good that by practice, you can get a feeling of what people are going to enjoy. So for me, it's a bit of sort of like reinforcement learning, which I publish a lot of posts, and then I can see what specific things that I do people react to. And then I start building also there's this feedback loop where people are telling me in some way what things they enjoyed the most. I don't know. It's hard, right?
It's one of those things that seems simple, but it's hard to definitely do it yourself. Two firms I would mention, like Olson Kundig or John Pawson, ones I've noticed, like there's a lot of similarities between their posts, a lot of like wood and warmth and just things that I think immediately catch you. John Pawson's a good example of like, it's a lot of photos of here's some dappled light on a nice textural wall, but then it has a ton of, not that it's about capturing likes, but clearly people do like this, as opposed to, a firm that might post a very curated post with text and a paragraph write-up and an overall like giant lobby photograph and maybe talking about awards and details. I just feel like sometimes there's a lot of effort that goes into making these crafted posts that people, maybe that's not the kind of thing they want to digest on something like Instagram. So I always wonder if maybe it's just the media. Like, is it better just to have these focused, going back to what we talked about before, kind of the human scale element, as opposed to trying to post something that feels like it's an Art Daily excerpt on Instagram? At least that's what I've noticed. I'm trying to take these pieces of things that I am noticing, like what are some patterns to what it seems like people like. And it seems like the ones that people are always gravitating to are these more simplistic, photographs.
It goes back to what you said before, like who's looking at them. If you share illustrations, maybe, I probably would appreciate a lot if you share like isometric views and like technical drawings and things like that are well represented. But somebody else who's outside of the architectural or like design realm might enjoy better like lively images or animations of a space that they would feel good using or like they would like to be there.
Makes them feel something though. That's a key word, is like what makes people feel something.
I think that something needs to be relatable. It needs to be novel, and in some way people need to be longing for something that is on that image, right? Like we're trying to create, at the end of the day, you're trying to create a necessity or like a need into people's minds. And there is something that I thought from what you were saying before. You have Instagram, for example, and I talked about web interfaces before. When you said something like Instagram, the Instagram user interface is, let's say it's boring because it doesn't change often, right? It's left there as a static thing because they want the highlight to be the image. The image is the thing that changes, and it's always constrained to the same layout, and what changes is the image, right? So many times you might have a web layout that is changing often, but the content is the same. And the novelty is like, wow, look how these images are presented now and how I can navigate and the colors and things. And then there is the other option where you leave the layout completely the same, but what is novel is the content and the message that you're sending. And, you can play with both, but you got to think about that as well. Like there is a way to communicate with the way of doing things. And the other is communicating with what you're doing. It's really different, but they mesh into something. And what's important about things like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram is that they remove the possibility of the how, and they focus on what, right? Like everyone writes with the same typeface on Twitter. You can use emojis or not or whatever, but we're all left to the same. So the equation, the only variable that changes is the text. And on Instagram is the image. The medium becomes left aside, and then you focus on the content, which is at the end of the day what you were talking about, like how to touch people with what you're saying or what you are showing in an image, but not with how you're doing it.
If you had some advice or maybe one thing to focus on, let's say there's a firm or a company that they're trying to completely change how they're perceived. There might be things like, okay, there's, again, a new flashy website, or they might change how they post on social media. I'm not saying those are the answers, but if you had to say there's like a bigger, deeper, is it more like a cultural, deeper rooted change? Like what is most important kind of to focus effort if you're really trying to make real changes for how you're perceived?
What you said before, right, about touching people, like trying to relate to them and doing little things that touch them. I think nowadays we're seeing it with like the crypto communities and software development and anything online that grows. They're creating these Discord communities, right? So it's a way to let the user or the client or the person who's interested interact with the creators and interact with the community that also likes what they like. Because Twitter allows that a bit, but it's not really. And on Instagram, it's like you are posting and everyone else is liking or replying or things. But what Discord allows is that everyone can do the same actions, which is like you can post on channels and share your things, your thoughts, and contribute to everyone else's experiences. So that's something that I'm trying to do. For example, with the podcast, I'm trying to bring in people so they can also talk to the audience. I'm asking the audience for questions. So like at gettingsimple.com/ask, for example, people can submit audio questions. And on the live stream, like we have that Discord community where people can join and can share the projects and can contribute with pointers. And yeah, for example, live streaming allows you a two-way conversation, but it's, you're live streaming and people can write on a chat, but it's not the same. It's hard. I mean, that doesn't translate to an architecture studio directly, but I would say the rebranding, just changing your website will give you a new feel, but it doesn't really change that much about how people perceive you, I think.
Another way to think of it, for you creating something with your work, and sort of your work's image or my company's image, how do you take steps to get to the point where people seek you out for what you want to do? I think that's kind of like one of the ultimate goals. These firms that you, in your mind at least, I mentioned Olson Kundig, it's like, at least you think that's how it is they have people seeking them out to do these really beautiful projects, whether it's architecture or whether it's software development or anything, whether it's making anything. There's potters that I follow on Instagram too that make these really nice, whatever, mugs, cups, plates, whatever your work is, whatever your craft is, how do you get to that point where people seek you out for the thing that you love doing?
That is a super good question. This is a double-edged sword, right? Because you can do things really well. Steve Martin had this quote that is the title of Cal Newport's book, that is, "Be so good they can't ignore you." And anything that you do really well, people will come and seek you out to do it, right? So you got to be careful of what you do really well. Because if you do, as you said before, constructive details really, really well, people are not going to set you on the Lumion section where you're like playing with Unreal and doing visualizations, right? You're going to stick with the constructive details, at least for that firm, because they get the most out of you out of that. And this is something that happens to me at work as well. Like I want to do, for example, machine learning research, but I involve myself a lot into more machine learning engineering and deployment operations, which means actually how you get machine learning to work, but not how to create the machine learning algorithms. If you become really good at something, that's what you're going to be the most useful to your team. And that way, you're probably going to be continuing developing on that area, unless there is room for somebody to say, okay, even though you're the best at constructive details, we're going to let you play with Lumion. It sounds unlikely. In your personal world, you have the chance to choose what projects you get involved in, unless you need to do them for the money. So if you can, I would say only engage in projects that you would do if you would be working on your own in a passion project. And that's super hard. But I personally have experienced that if you only take on those projects, people by word of mouth and because of people that have worked with you, as you said before, those types of projects will continue to come. And it's okay to say no to some projects if you feel like, this is not it. Because that project, if it's not it, it will take time for you from doing other projects or from looking for other clients or accepting other opportunities.
It's a ripple effect. I think you've mentioned that before, that you have to be okay with saying no. It's easy to want to say yes and want to feel obligated to get involved with everything. But if it's ultimately slowing down sort of bigger picture initiatives, then it is okay to say no sometimes.
So I had this concept that I talked to with Scott Mitchell in a previous podcast episode a few years back. And he had this concept of the podium, right? So we didn't mention that before, but I wanted to bring it in. He imagines a room where you have it's like a circle, and you have different versions of your ideal desk. Maybe there's a standing desk, there's like a couch where you can play your guitar and everything set up there with your preamp and your mics and all that stuff. There is another, maybe a standing desk that you can take up and down with a really good monitor, has already a computer switched on for working with Lumion and Rhino and your preferred software. And maybe you have another desk that is only for drawing. Maybe you have your watercolors, your pens. And imagine one of these different podiums, right, as a place where you already have everything that you need to do a given thing. So for example, another one could have your recording setup for like movies, and you just take the bag and everything's ready and you don't have to go to storage, as you mentioned before, right? So that is the ideal way to reduce friction, right? But there is like mental space limitations, right? Like you cannot switch from task to task and super fast. And there's also physical space limitations where you cannot have everything just installed to be used at any point in time. There is also like a reference to Harry Slowly, another podcast by Jocelyn K. Glei. I remember that Austin Kleon mentioned he actually has 2 physical desks at his work studio, where he has one to work with a computer and one to work by hand with pencils and things like this, which seems like a really good thing. I try to do it sometimes. I try to move to a different desk to sketch by hand and then move to a different desk to work with the computer. And then there is also the concept of the cabin, right? Like the writing cabin, that's a bit more common, where you have a house in the woods and then there's this little cabin, maybe, I don't know, like 20 meters or like 50 meters away. It's like a really small cabin and it's offline, right? You only have your writing pad or maybe like a typewriter or a computer. So those would be ideal. And I personally try to do this with what I'm recording now, right? I have a chroma behind me. I have a light. I have the camera installed, the boom arm for the mic and all the setup. So I try to do this for myself because one of the intentions that I have for this and the new year is to reduce friction in many processes. One of the things that I'm trying to reduce friction with is actually releasing podcasts, right? Recording and releasing podcasts, because it ends up being a super tedious process where it's annoying to do. If it takes me 1 week to plan, record, edit, delegate, and then publish the episode, it becomes a dread. But if it's like a 1 or 2 day thing where I say, okay, I'm coming into the studio, I have scheduled the call and prepare my notes, we record, I send this to somebody to edit the audio, and then I come back and have a few commands or a few things on my blog that I can just post the episode. It becomes a lot easier to engage into the process. I think we talked about this. I wanted to lead into a question for you because I experienced this, and I think we talked about this a lot in North Carolina 10 years back. The chaos of taking pictures, right? Like you love your camera, you take a lot of photos, you take a lot of footage, but then you hit the reality and then you go back home and say like, I have, I don't know, 1,500 photos and I have like 2 hours of footage. And I have to take care of my kids and I have to go on with my week.
It's funny because I feel like that also, it generates more friction and it gets harder as technology improves, I know that seems a little backwards because you would think with more technology, things get easier. But as you get better cameras with better sensors, and now you're shooting files that are 50 to 80 megabytes per image. And now you end up doing a shoot or video shoot or photo shoot, coming back with like 50 to 100 gigabytes. Like you're starting to like more and more increase this capacity of like how much time it's going to take to transfer and just work with these larger files. I don't know if I mentioned, but in the last few years, I also got drone license. So I added that to the toolkit. So when I go out, I have this massive backpack and tripods and just all this stuff physically weighing me down. You know, you get back and you're emotionally weighed down with all the content, but you got all this heavy stuff you're lugging around, and you have drone footage, you have lavalier footage from a microphone that's separate from your one DSLR, and then you have your second DSLR capturing the other one. So when you come back to put together a video, yeah, there's 10 different pieces that you have to try to stitch together. So the amount of emotional friction to just get that first step of trying to get all those elements separately into something and then try to stitch them. It does feel like you have to do hours of setup just to get to the point where you can be creative. And I think, again, that's kind of the mental hump. It's like, I just want to start like cutting this down and editing it and starting to piece together my art piece, you know, my narrative, but I have to do all these things before I get to that point. That's why I'm really fascinated by the steps you're making to, you know, automate things. I know there are ways to, like, there's ways to shoot and have things over whatever Wi-Fi or cloud-based networks, like have them automatically start to download or upload somewhere else. There's probably ways to tether your audio to your DSLR so that at least comes together packaged. But so yeah, there's steps I think to reduce that might involve some upfront research.
I'm interested on what you just said, right? Like I talked about the chaos of coming back and having a lot of footage, a lot of things to edit. And as you just mentioned, something that we're doing here right now, you're recording audio on your end, you're recording video. We have 2 feeds from you. I have one for me. We have different audio files. We'll have to stitch everything together. Up to what point is it overdoing it, right? Like I've seen other people, for example, would have done this directly, YouTube live stream. You just get the 2 webcam feeds, the 2 audio feeds, put it there. And then when I go and you go, that's already published on YouTube. We don't do anything else. We get the audio, put it on the podcast and done. So how much is it overdoing it? And is it worth it, right? That's my question all the time. So definitely for some YouTubers that have like millions of views, which I don't, it feels a bit more worth it. Like paying people or like getting all the gear, all the things. For me, like getting gear has been an investment exactly for that. If I have a recording studio, I have less background noise, I have less audio. I know that the quality is going to be better. I don't have to going to be worrying about that. And as you said, there's a few pieces that I thought from before how it's going to be done later in post-processing. And it saves a lot of time later or even allows you to do the creative process better, as you mentioned, because if you don't think about certain things, then you might end up with only, let's say, over the internet, 2 feeds that are baked on the same audio file. There's no editing you can do there because the 2 audios are stitched together already and you cannot edit. Right now I have 2 separate tracks, one for your voice, one for mine. There is more possibilities, but also more time investment that needs to go into that refining. So how much is it overthinking or overdoing?
Same thing with like an architectural photo shoot. Let's just use an interior shot as an example. You know, you might take, 100 shots just to get one photo. I'm sure you're aware of how the process goes of trying to get all these different scenarios of people in different spots so you can come back and stitch them together into a singular shot. Or maybe you forget to move a chair or a poster or something distracting out of the way. So now you got to come back and clone that out. There are some like physical steps, that you can take to reduce the friction of editing, but it's one of those things that I feel like I'm going to be stuck in this process somewhat because it does come down to details, and I'm someone who's obsessed with little details. I know you are a detail-oriented person too, but it's always, I would hate to miss something that might make it better. But then I do wonder, is that something that only I'm going to notice and appreciate just because I was so fixated on it that small little thing or element that's been masked out, or I don't know, just pieces in a photograph that I'm hyper aware of. Is someone else hypersensitive to that? Possibly not, or probably not. So is it a matter of just judgment of oneself So you know about it, so you have to do it.
So it comes back to what you said before. The people who are trying to replicate your same processes will take a look at that, right? Like the people who are videographers or like artists or like scenographers, they'll pay attention to those things and they'll spot it and say, he didn't remove this thing, or like, oh, I can see that. But I think for people who are not in your field, they will notice something is off maybe, but they won't know what it is. So it's about trying to create that harmony of things so people feel more relaxed or like feel better when they see that. I think it was Stanley Kubrick that said that if it exists, you shouldn't make it. For like when people try to recreate fake scenarios for movies and things like that. I know that the kind of the cardboard culture or gypsum board in Hollywood, they are used to remaking everything on the set, so they have control over the lighting and they have it all like maybe in California or things like this. And now actually we could loop back into Unreal, which is what you mentioned before, which, you know, in for example, The Mandalorian, they made all of the backgrounds, right? So the actors have the real lighting bouncing naturally on them instead of having to simulate it. And we're going back again to say, okay, if it doesn't exist, you just should make it virtually instead of going to that place and record and stuff. I often, when I see those behind the scenes takes, I often feel like how much boring or how much empty is the recording experience, right? To actors, because they're sitting like me with a green chroma or some like Unreal window or like a screen, right? And they're recording as if they were like on a, I don't know, on a car or in like a spaceship or things like that, right? Whereas before you could be on set and at least see some things there.
I guess that's what makes a good actor versus not one. Someone who can interact with a human wearing a bunch of motion capture pieces that's supposed to be an animal or something. I don't know. You've seen videos of that, yeah, where it's behind the scenes and it's a person trying to act with something that's just not real. But again, I guess that's why they're good actors. They can do that. It is interesting though.
Because of what we were talking before, that, you know, you also need to have your leisure time and social connection and do things that are not work, to disconnect. How do you go about capturing the creative moments, right? Little pieces of inspiration or things that come to your mind when you're not at work. Do you have a way to do that? Would you like to do it differently?
I think I would just like to do it more consistently. I think I need to document things better, like little pieces that inspire me, because I do find myself, I mentioned watching a lot of videos. Sometimes, you know, it might be an hour-long video and there might only be 2 minutes of it that's like directly related to something I want to learn. But I feel like in most situations, if it's an article or something I'm reading, there's always at least one piece that feels like it's touched on some nerve that's like, oh, that's useful. It's like, I don't know exactly how I'm going to apply that yet, but it's like, it feels like you learned or you discovered something in that process. And sometimes it's hard because it's not as easy as just writing down a sentence in my notebook. It's that extra step of trying to figure out how to apply that, you know, and I don't know what the best thing is. And that's why I was so, you know, attracted to your periodicity discussion. Is I think I find things and discover things and I find them interesting and I might write it down, but you can still forget about that even if you write it down. I mean, it's there for safekeeping, but it might not be applied. So at least moving forward, that's kind of on my list after this discussion. Something I'm taking away is I'm going to take a step to actually apply that, you know, even if it's not to its full capabilities yet, but just taking some kind of step to apply that in whatever way that I feel like will be useful. You
get started with a habit, then it gets to be a trap where you have so many things, right? Your brain is ideating so many things that you want to do that you got to capture those things to say, okay, I have them captured and I'll review what I actually want to do. And I think the ones that pop the most often, as Steven Johnson said, right? Like he has a Spark file with all of the ideas. So he captures all of the ideas of things that he thinks, oh, I would like to do this. I would like to automate this. I would like to learn this. He writes there, and the ones that pop up the most often, he says, okay, maybe with the project I'm working on right now, or because I seem to be obsessed with this thing, this is the thing that I need to give it a try. Otherwise, you're going to be always moving and switching with the hype, right? Or whatever is on your mind.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a difference between jotting something down and, doing it. So I think a recent example would be I'm trying to get into, photogrammetry for drone scanning a site, having a photogrammetry and site scanned map that I can then bring into some software and have a mesh that you could use in Revit, or something like that. So it might be something like that I was watching a video and I saw the software they were using, and instead of just writing on the software, I'm trying to take steps of like, well, I'm going to go look that up now, download it. If it is a free trial, I'll go ahead and get my hands in that. So I have some kind of understanding just to make things real, or Lumion, I know they just had a new release and I've already watched plenty of videos like here's new things in Lumion 12, and I'll honestly say that I didn't have access to it until recently, but I still haven't downloaded that and tested it. So it's one of those things that getting in and then dropping in one of those new spotlights and seeing how it works, that really does connect some dots, I think, in your brain. That's like, okay, now I see what that does, I see how it's useful, and you'll ultimately be more likely to use that moving forward as opposed to just writing it down. It's easy to forget.
Let's go into the last section I do usually on the podcast on this type of interviews, is asking disconnected questions. They can lead to anything, but the first one would be, do you have any daily routines that make your life more productive or like that make you feel happier or better?
Daily routines that's outside of the normal routine of just getting kids to daycare and work. And it's harder to answer now because I'm at a place where I'm still working from home all the time. So my routine a lot is kind of similar environment. But I think honestly, one thing that wasn't as important in the office, there were more distractions in the office, more, physical collaborations, or I would always go out to get coffee and bring it back. You had those things working in the office. Something I have to be more aware of working from home is trying to disconnect. It's easy to I have a sit-stand desk. Yes, it's not a big enough transition to just stand for a while and sit for a while. If I'm still at my computer all day, it's a bit destructive after a while to be not separating from that. Your mind isn't as fresh. So routine, I'm trying to, I don't know if you would say practice mindfulness. You mentioned meditation, but yes, I'm also just trying to take some time where I completely kind of separate and zone out of what I'm working on. Even if it's 10 minutes, that might be what it takes to throw on a song and just really, really focus in on what's happening on a song. Or if there was an article or a book that I was reading, that's a good time to step away and just try to focus and tap into a different side of, again, meditating in a way just to clear my head. I'd say specifically though, that's what it would be, is I've been building up my book library with things that I find interesting. I won't go into a big list now, but just trying to clear my head with something completely unrelated from what I was working on. I'm trying to do that more frequently.
What would be some recommendations?
So one example I didn't bring over, but I do also like to, I've been building up just a catalog of books or articles of photographs that I find is good reference for renderings. I think it's doing things like, ArcViz, it's nice to have reference imagery that you can look at. And no matter what, just having something that's a similar vibe, exterior or interior, to use as a way to see something that exists in real life for lighting and things like that. So having a catalog of reference imagery is something also sometimes I'll separate just to find some inspiration and say, oh, here's a photo that is going to push me this way. So you might lose track sometimes of the mood or tone of an image for a rendering. So having a catalog there helps. And also I'm trying to have more mood boards online where I'll just find things and have this scattered mood board of reference imagery. But here's two books I was mentioning. This one is, I guess it's somewhat work related though, but if you can see it.
The Photography Storytelling Workshop.
This is definitely one somewhat more work related, but we've been talking so much about storytelling that this is another way. I found a book that's very much focused on, how to pull that narrative as opposed to just having a sterile image of a space, but trying to have something more. Here's one I think you would like that actually a recent purchase, but
Inside the Lives of Noteworthy Individuals, Justin Chung.
Yeah, it's called Faculty Department. This is one that you should definitely look into. It's basically a series of studies and write-ups of people in his life that he's calling noteworthy individuals. You do all these podcasts with people, but he's dedicated a book to different people in his life that for whatever reason he is finding noteworthy of having write-ups and research into their life. Those are two definitely the last one for you would be great. For any photographers, the first one would be useful. But also in general, I just like having, again, books of architectural photographs because I find them very useful as rendering reference.
So what would be your message to the world if you could send like a paper sheet to every single person?
At a smaller scale first, I've had some discussions with students just getting out of architecture school, and I've sort of, from personal experience, mentioned to them is kind of stretch the idea of architect. And maybe you can take the same notion and apply it to other fields, but at least with my personal experience, it's like, don't get defined by what you think the word architect means and by the path that you've seen others do. There's ability, especially now, to have plenty of divergent paths in the architecture field. So that's my advice to young designers or people fresh out of school is find what really makes you passionate and get good at it and make that a necessity in a firm. There's going to be a need for that, but do make sure it's something you enjoy doing. As you mentioned, if you get good at something, people will have you doing it. So make sure that's what you want. I've also had people, in my last firm, he's awesome at drone photography and videography. He just was really skilled at, flight control and also composition. We had a small drone studio in the last firm, and I asked him to join a few times, but his answer was always, it's like he was scared to do it for work or it wouldn't be fun anymore, like on the side. Because right now he only did it for pleasure and for trips and for fun. So he wouldn't get involved with the work drone studio because he didn't want it to be related to work at all.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was mentioning before, right? That the moment that it turns into an obligation, it stops being fun. And then you don't have that differentiation point.
Yeah, that's also useful knowledge just for anyone that would be listening is make a careful choice and spend some time thinking about that before you do mix, what you find enjoyable with work is make sure you're okay doing it a lot.
There is something that you mentioned on our previous conversation that is that you enjoy the process of grinding the beans on the press, right? It might take 15 minutes versus 60 seconds in an automated machine, but
I'm sure that's different for some people too, is, they might think coffee is coffee. They might think it comes, whatever, from Starbucks or from McDonald's or from the local coffee place downtown that they get their coffee, they're happy. But as far as, making it home, if it's going to take 15 minutes to do it by hand or, 2 minutes to push a button and have it, that might even tie into another way of kind of decompressing and stress relief during the day is having some rituals like that. It might even tie into the meditation ritual is making coffee. But again, you have to figure out if that's something that you care about. But I think that's also because if there's something I end up liking, which I found a liking to coffee, I become obsessed with the details, is like the nuances of how can you make it different. But more specifically to, what you're saying is, I don't know, I definitely found an attraction to finding the beans, grinding them myself, the process of making the French press, just understanding everything that goes into kind of behind the scenes, and the tactile nature of making this cup of coffee somehow makes it more enjoyable to me. I'm someone who also, for a long time, I've enjoyed having, my turntable and vinyl collection, and the process of thumbing through this list of albums, finding one, seeing the album artwork, and knowing that you're committing to an hour of listening to a record, and the process of this analog system. And I think it's also kind of resistance and fighting against just this fast-paced digital world where it's so quick and easy to digest things. It's nice to slow down from that, make the cup of coffee that way. Same thing with Spotify or Apple Music. It's so easy just to bounce around between everything. So I think anything I can hold on to that gives more intent, this selection of like, I'm going to commit to an hour of this album, it's this process of feeling like you're getting something more out of it. If you just listen to one song at a time from many different albums and it's on shuffle, it becomes background. When you listen to an album all the way through and you look at the album art and, the lyrics a bit more and just everything that's part of the package, at least it makes you feel like there's this extra piece, that you're getting out of it. Maybe something to learn, maybe something you can take away from it, make yourself better. I know that seems crazy with the notion of making coffee, but it still feels like going through all the steps in this process, there's some more appreciation that somehow makes it more enjoyable.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I see sometimes I try to do the same, like listening to the full album one after the other, or even making my custom playlist, but not be longer than 45 minutes or so. So they look like my own album instead of just like going random and not knowing what you're listening at every point in time. And I think enjoying that process, there is an important part, which is scheduling. So if you're actually doing that, many times it can happen organically, but if you don't need to make time to make coffee, right? You can make it anytime you want.
Mm-hmm.
But for other things, to be able to enjoy that process and not feel that you're just going from like doing this thing and then this thing and then this other thing, you do have to schedule and reserve time to do that as if it was work or like a work meeting. It might seem crazy, but I started using my calendar more and more lately. I had never done a huge use of calendar, but as I used it at work and then I started using it for my personal stuff to be able to schedule things with my partner or with friends and to actually make sure that I had certain slots reserved and that I wouldn't put work during leisure time or leisure time during work. And yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around it. It seems like everything that is not work should happen organically, but believe that's that way.
It's useful to be intentional too, I think, with time. And I think I could be, better that way, because something's going to take up your time during the day and during the week, and if it's not by your choice and your scheduling, there's a good chance that it's going to get, taken up by your phone or by another screen if you're not careful. So having plans to avoid that, I think, can go a long way with feeling like you're at least being productive and creative. It's a good way to not look back in 6 months and say, how am I in this rut?
I have a quote here from Laura Vanderkam. That's 168 Hours is the name of her book. And she says, better to build a life where you don't need to write off any time as an inevitable obligation. Creating the right job is the first step to using the hours you do work in the most effective way possible. That's super hard to achieve, right? But that's what we've been talking about, is finding a way in which what you're doing might be passion projects, work, or actual your daily job. It's enjoyable and it allows you to not feel like a dread, even though there will be always be times in which you don't want to do what you have to do, right?
I think that's kind of one of the end goals. I think the sad reality of it is whatever your work time is you spend more time of your life doing that than maybe seeing your loved ones or seeing your kids. Like that time that is in the hours of work ends up being a massive chunk, of your time in your life. So at the best of our ability, it makes sense to at least make that into something that's fulfilling.
I also have this feeling that automation also brings satisfaction, right? Like you can enjoy the process of knowing that you're saving time doing a given process, or that you are doing it better, or that the accuracy is going to be increased, or the quality of the outcome is going to be better every time that you do it in the future. There is that, so enjoying the process of doing it. I like programming automations and things like this. I get satisfaction. This is being done by itself. I don't have to do it anymore. And then, of course, what we talked about before, like you reduce friction to a minimum, and then that allows you to focus on some other things, right? I already know this process is done this way. I'm not going to do it anymore, or at least I'll do it in fewer steps, and I can get to learn the next tool or get to add the next piece to my workflow. So that's something that we need to also embrace. Unless you can have a lifestyle where you say, okay, I don't need to automate anything of what I do. I enjoy it as it is, and I'll go on with my life.
So I think the problem is like knowing the end goal is like, where you're trying to go with your brain, but then knowing it's going to take you 3 hours just to go through the motions to get there. Like that's when it feels like I'm not being creative and not doing something. So if you can come up with some kind of software or automation that can get past that chunk of time that you're not modeling it, then you can start again using your brain creatively elsewhere. That's huge. Something like an example, like modeling something, let's use SketchUp as the example versus Grasshopper. If there's a way I can completely rearrange and change the facade with sliders or moving around nodes in Grasshopper, that's something that might take you 5 hours to then remodel in SketchUp. So there's the difference between having to use your brain to push the design forward versus use your brain power to just grind through mouse clicking and hand cramps and steps.
Yeah, and I think you said something important, which is the creativity. I would say the steps that you have to automate as much as possible are the ones that are not creative. The moment that you see that something is creative, and this is, I completely relate to this on the podcast. I'm trying to automate everything that is basically algorithmic. That is like, copy this image and rename it with this name. Get the episode number here and put it there. Copy the text that is written here and put it there. Share this thing with this format in that platform. All that can be automated, but there is what is left out to me or to the editors is like what piece of conversation we leave in or take out. What words do I use to describe what's going on this episode? What message do I write for people to read on the newsletter or on social media when I share this, right? So those are the creative variables that still require a human. There will be a point where, machines are creative enough to say, okay, they said friction and automation and creativity 20 times more than any other word. So I'm going to just say, okay, what are their names? It's Nono and Jordan talking about automation, friction, and creativity. That will save my day. I mean, I don't need more than that, right? But you need to be involved into the process. And I think we still have that little bit of human creativity for us to provide to the process. Everything else is just for the machines.
I remember in school, people were scared of the idea of like BIM and Revit. Like there was a big conversation towards the end of school where it's like, we're going to have this software that's going to take all the human thinking and all the design thinking out of it. Like it's going to be restrictive for the way you can design things based off how it's input or, based off the, restrictions of the software. But I mean, I don't really find that happening. I think that as long as we consider them all as tools, that do different things, it's SketchUp, Rhino, Revit, whatever, like everything is just a tool to help us push things creatively as best as we can. So it's also good advice to not get too fixated on one thing. If there's a tool that does something better, use that to your advantage.
I want to ask you something a bit unrelated. How would you define simplicity?
It's definitely one of those things that's hard to put into words. It's like one of those things that, I was describing social media pages, like seeing something, like it's easy to see something and catalog it as simple. And, that's one of those things that we always kind of strive for, I think, in design is simplicity. Like you want to do things as simple as you can and as little steps to get the point across. I think that's starting to touch on it. Its simplicity is kind of just enough so it's doing what it needs to. Once you start to add things past that point, it's becoming, at least as far as architecture, that's when it's becoming ornamentation or decorative or crossing that barrier. But as far as in terms of life uses, I don't know, it's still somewhere on that line of what's the point where something's just enough to serve its purpose or its function and nothing more than that. I don't know. Again, it's hard to describe, but like definitely like the idea of simplicity and minimalism. I feel like those are things that are starting to like stretch the definite, like online now too. Like if you think back to architecture school, I feel like when you said modern design, it meant something. I feel like simplicity and minimalism are also getting kind of muddied on the internet the last few years. Like if you used to search that on Google, modern meant something in particular, but now modern, it's just like all over the place with what people define as something that's modern or contemporary. I think that's the issue with like simplicity and minimalism is it's been kind of skewed from so many vantage points and dragged across the internet that it's getting a bit watered down with its meaning, at least. That's why I feel like it's one of those things that you can at least see and recognize instead of describe.
I've done this a few times. If you go to Google Trends and you write something like simplicity or simplify your life, I don't know if you know what it is. It just basically tells you what's been searched more over time if you put a few terms on. And I think, simplicity or simplify or things like these concepts are having a bit of a hype over the past maybe 40 or 50 years. They keep growing. It's easy to market them, right? Because it's always this story that something will make your life easier, something that will remove complexities, right? What's the name of this page actually? So it's not Google Trends that I'm looking for. It's Google Ngram. So Google Trends tells you about things that have been searched on Google for since Google was created. But if I write here on Google Ngram, and for those of you that nobody's seeing this because I'm not recording this on screen, but I'm here on books.google.com/ngrams, and I'm gonna type simplicity, simplify, and maybe simplify your life or something like that. So these are different terms that you can search for. So simplify in literature definitely goes up, and around the 2000s it starts going down. And simplicity actually was, I don't know why, but it was super high in 1820, and then now it's going lower and now going up again. But yeah, you can look at these terms and see when they were hype, right? If you look for simplify your life, it spikes up in the 2000s. It spikes more in 2010, and then it's going down, and it's kind of like, I don't know why, but it's just like crashing. So it's like these things. We are, at least for myself, if I write here minimalism, it's a spike since 1980, and it's just going up and up and up. So it's, these are trends, and we get in some way marketed with them because it's gonna make our lives easier. And as you said, it just gets meshed with many, many different concepts.
It's, because I do think it's like parts of it become a fad. You think about, there's a lot of people that are promoting like living in a van, but at the same time, this van is something that was like really expensive and really upfitted and renovated and rather fancy and not really simple in itself. But they're trying to promote the idea that, they're detaching from the norm of owning a house and being tied to a job, and there's simple living in a van. So I feel like there's so many examples of like that again, like it's hard to understand what that means, because I feel like there's other people that would say my life would not be simpler by living in a van, but the people that are doing it are saying that it's to simplify their lives. That's just, again, a random example. Do you have kind of a epiphany for what simple means after talking to a lot of people on the podcast? Is there any nugget of information that you would pass on that maybe you've already said it 100 times, so if I'm making you repeat something, but I'm kind of personally interested now?
The motto of the podcast is do less better. That's kind of like the Dieter Rams, less but better. I think in concept, less is better, or do less better is like the getting simple motto. But I think as automation and technology comes into our lives, we start to fall into the trap to think that we can do more in less, right? Like instead of do less better, we try to do more in less time, faster, and we get into this trap that is really hard. Sometimes I think like, I could quit the podcast, I could quit the live stream, I could quit many things and then do whatever I want, but it gives meaning to what I do, right? Like it's a growth project where I learn, where I practice skills and things like this. And I think it's simplicity in some way, from a conversation between Tim Ferriss and David Allen, so the creator of Getting Things Done, where the name of the podcast kind of branched out into simplicity. He says that there is an acceptable point in which you commit to yourself to do things that you cannot deliver, that gives you stress, right? So there is a hype concept as well that is the art of stress-free productivity. I think that's the subtitle of his book or something like that, which is we need to find ways to be productive, but in a way that no matter how much you're doing, it doesn't need to be less, but no matter how much you're doing, you can tackle it and you can deliver to what you commit to yourself, right? Not to other people, not to external deadlines, but if you said that one essay a week is what you're going to do, you need to find the ways in which you can do that without adding a super stressful routine to your life, right? We can all publish an essay every day if we want to, but we might not be able to do anything else in our lives, right? Other than that, because you have to constantly be thinking. But you might find that you can maybe do batch writing on Sundays, and maybe on January and February, you can prepare essays to publish for the rest of the year if they're short enough, right? So I'm pretty sure like a lot of people have this sort of techniques where you say, okay, I'm going to do a season for the podcast. So I'm going to record 30 episodes in a month, and then I publish automatically for 6 months. And then I come back on July and record 30 more or something like that, as opposed to do it weekly. But then you lose that thing of your periodicity, right? Like you're actually, if you batch it, you're going to become really, 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 really good. And then you're going to spike down until you come back to it. And then again, right? And yeah, I don't know. I don't have if we go back to many other episodes, we've talked about many different aspects of what simplicity and intuitive mean. And I think it comes down to reducing the unnecessary steps in your life. It doesn't matter. So if the person living on the van is okay with all the steps they have to do, it's okay. But if you're at home and you're used to put all your like plates and glasses into the dishwasher, and you're used to your, your heat at home, and you're used to doing chores the way you do them at home, then you're going to accrue extra work by going out into the field. The person who lives on the van might go home and then find that they now have to broom, and they now have to clean the house, and they have to like make their big beds, or like remove things and tidy the house when people come in, things that they might not have to do on the van. So I don't know. It's really personal, really specific. It's not something that you can take and generalize. But yeah, I don't have any super big pointers. Probably later after we stop recording, I'll come up with, I should have mentioned this and that. But that caught me off guard.
That's how it goes.
Yeah,
always.
That's how it goes. So we need to capture that for the next conversation, I guess. So before I forget, can you tell our audience where they can find you online, where they can see some of your footage and your projects?
It's funny because I feel like I'm also always in the middle of trying to change my personal website and branding and everything going on with that. But quickly though, I do work, full time at a firm right now called Henberry that's in Raleigh, North Carolina. I haven't really been doing freelance specifically just because it was one of those things that almost became, I won't call it friction, but it became one of those things that I didn't need that creative outlet there anymore. I was kind of getting that at work, but I do still have a lot of my content online. I still add to it from different sources. My Vimeo page is just vimeo.com/Jordan Gray. My website currently is graycollab.com, graycollab.com. So Gray Collaborative was something I started back when I was doing freelance renderings and photography and videography. And, the idea behind that was, and it's still actually something I leave that as a good, ending point too, is the idea of finding people to collaborate with and like-minded people when it comes to different creative outlets, whether that's for my photography or renderings. I typically wasn't setting out to do these by myself, but part of what was the intrigue of this was trying to learn and grow even outside of work. So it was having these testing grounds to do things with other people and having someone to bounce ideas off of with and grow with, whether that was renderings or, I was always interested in furniture making. So I had some people that would do woodworking. So the collaborative part was stressing the importance of surrounding yourself with other talented people and always trying to grow by working with people. That's something I've always realized in this profession too, is there's always people that are better. There's always people that are better that are sharing things. So always be aware that there's always room for growing. And a lot of times that's, brought about by, again, collaborating with others.
Yeah, that's super important because the quality of the outcomes grows exponentially, I think. When you try to tackle a project with only yourself as a one-person enterprise, it's daunting to do everything you would be able to do. I mean, some of the best things that I've released have to do with maybe videos that I've released that have been produced by other people that I've collaborated with and things like that. And I keep looking also to collaborate with more people.
People always see things differently. Even if you feel like you might have something not perfect, but something that you're happy with, someone will always point something out that you didn't see that can help make it better. So again, it's invaluable to always be getting opinions from others.
Awesome. So I think this makes it. I've had a lot of fun with our conversation. Thanks so much for being here. It was my pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you, No. This was good. It was good to catch up, just in general to have a conversation. But, thanks for all the different points you brought to it. It was, again, useful, and not to be a broken record, but periodicity. I feel like I have to say that in my head before I say it out loud. You said you were brushing up on some of your English, but that's a tough one to roll out. Periodicity, but that's a big one that I'm pulling away from this. I feel like that's been on my mind lately. Like, not necessarily that word, but that defines what's been on my mind, which was trying to make it a point to just do things consistently. That's a takeaway point. Is I feel like I've had conversations with coworkers where we feel like we've had this creative block where we're inspired to do things, but we feel stuck sometimes just not making it happen or not taking the next steps. Or we're seeing these other people on social media that's like, they're doing these things that always seem so creative. It's like, I feel like I want to be part of that process, personally doing that too. So again, periodicity and making it a good habit just to take first steps. You said, even if it's, 2 minutes of sketching or writing, even if it's just something that seems like such a small amount of time, I think that it definitely adds up over the months and years. And it's a good way just to get momentum going in the right direction. So thanks again, No.
Awesome. Thank you. Before you go, I'll remind you that you can send questions about this or any previous episodes at gettingsimple.com/ask. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll see you next time.